Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We will get started in about a minute after, just to let some more folks trickle in. For anyone just now joining, we will get started about a minute after. And now it's a minute after. So, thank you all so much for joining us today. This webinar is going to be recorded and posted on our website later this week. But if there are any questions or anything we can follow up on, please email agpolicy@uark.edu. This is an open webinar, so anybody is welcome to be on it. So if you don't feel comfortable asking any questions in the chat or off mute, like I said, feel free to send us any follow-up questions. And now we will kick it off. So if you're not familiar with who we are the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We were formed at the University of Arkansas School of Law in 2013 under the leadership of two incredible Native agriculture attorneys, Janie Sins Hip and Stacy Leeds. A lot of you guys may know Janie as the former USDA General Counsel, and Stacy became the first Native American Dean of Law, or Dean of a law school during her time at the University of Arkansas. They both saw a need for tribal policy and legal research expertise, and IFAI has helped to fill that role for more than a decade now. Our mission is to enhance Our mission is to enhance the health and wellness of tribal communities, diversify economic developments, and support for tribal food traditions. And with that being said, there's us, and I will turn it over to today's speaker, Carly Griffith Hotvedt, our Executive Director here at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative.
Thank you, Jamie. Oceanagad, Carly Hotvedt, Dagwado, Chichalagi. Hello, everyone. My name is Carly Griffith Hotvedt. I am an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm an attorney, and as Jamie mentioned, the Executive Director of IFAI. I'm happy to join you today. I'm going to be asking Jamie to assist me with advancing the slides. I look forward to sharing information with you about recently issued executive orders and other executive actions that have the potential to impact Indian country agriculture and food systems. Some of the information we share is going to be more broadly applicable, and some we will target towards federal programs that are serving tribal agriculture operations. Next slide. So our agenda today, we're going to talk about what an executive order is and how that differs from what an executive action is. And we'll go through some of those impacts of those executive orders and executive actions related to regulations and rulemaking, animal health provisions, tribal lands and resources, and then USDA and BIA staffing. And we'll follow up with some opportunities about what resources or actions that tribes can take related to these executive orders if necessary. And then I'm hopeful that we can save a little bit of time at the end to answer any questions that you all may have. I do want to provide the caveat, while I am an attorney, I am not anybody else's attorney who's attending this. And any of the information that we provide is not legal advice. Please take that as guidance. And we definitely recommend consulting your own tribe's counsel with any sort of particular concerns or issues that you might have related to the impact or outcome of these executive orders, or how they may how you may navigate them in the future and what that might mean for your tribe or your organization. Next slide. Okay, what is an executive order? An executive order is an official document which the President of the United States uses to manage the operations of the federal government. It's kind of a baseline. This is how we're going to do things, and this is what we want to do. This is why it's a priority, and sometimes even a little bit of how it's going to occur. They're directives that are issued by the president that are based on the president's constitutional or statutory authority. While they've generally been related to how the federal government is managed or operated, recent administrations have used them to implement policies and programs. Executive orders are official policy. They are required to be included and published in the Federal Register, and they can be revoked by the president at any time. It doesn't just have to be an executive order that president has developed or issued. It can also be prior administrations as well. Under Title 44 of the United States Code in Section 1505, those executive orders are documents that have general applicability and legal effect. They must be published in the Federal Register, as I mentioned, unless they are effective only against federal agencies or persons in their capacity as officers, agents, or employees thereof. That statute is available, as I mentioned, 44 United States Code, Section 1505, if you want to take a look at that. Next slide. So we talked about what an executive order is. What's an executive action or memorandum? They're similar to executive orders, except they are not required to be printed in the Federal Register. They're not required to cite to the president's legal authority. And in regards to those executive actions, the Office of Management and Budget is not required to issue a budgetary impact statement. As we mentioned, they differ from an executive order. They don't necessarily have a legal definition and not required to be published in the Federal Register. Executive actions have been used by presidents to call on Congress or their administration to take action or refrain from taking action. Less formal than executive orders do not carry the same legal weight. When OMB issues a budgetary impact statement, those statements are intended to address the financial implications of executive orders and actions. Those memoranda provide an analysis of how the proposed actions will affect the federal budget, including potential costs and savings. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about some specific executive orders and what they mean in this section related to regulations and rulemaking. So we have three listed here. The first one we're going to talk about is Executive Order 14148, which is the initial rescissions of executive orders and actions. What this executive order does is revoke 78 specific executive orders from the previous administration that are related mostly to racial equity, COVID-19 response, and climate policies. Some of the ones that have the potential to impact Indian country that are being rescinded include Executive Order 13985, which focuses on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. Executive Order 14049, which is the White House Initiative on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunity for Native Americans and Strengthening Tribal Colleges and Universities. I know there's already been a lot of commentary from organizations and tribal colleges and universities that are being impacted by this. AHEC is a good resource to get some additional information about what those potential impacts may be. We're also talking about Executive Order 14031 of May 28, 2021, which focuses on advancing equity, justice, and opportunities for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And Executive Order 14091 that focuses on further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. This executive order, the one that does the rescission, 14148, encourages federal executives to review and recommend other executive orders to rescind as well. We'll move on to the next bullet, which is Executive Order 14215, ensuring accountability for all agencies. Executive departments and agencies and independent regulatory agencies are required to submit significant regulatory actions for review by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs before publication. Additionally, independent regulatory agency chairmen shall regularly consult with and coordinate policies and priorities with the directors of the Office of Management and Budget, the White House Domestic Policy Council, and the White House National Economic Council. There's also an indication that agency employees shall also be bound to the president's interpretation of the law. That section has generated a lot of commentary and a lot of concern related to who has the final authority about how the law is supposed to be interpreted. What we see as a potential impact for Indian country, in some instances, there's some speculation it could be minimal. However, this order is also expected to apply to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. This one was kind of interest to me Based on my background in agriculture economics, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has origins in regulating commodities trading, and which includes like grain futures, wheat futures trading, and other types of commodities trading. Its bigger responsibility is regulating those financial futures, which also include cryptocurrency trading. That organization is under the jurisdiction of the Senate and House Agriculture Committees when it comes to the topic matter that they cover. If there is influence or directives that are issued that pursuant to this executive order that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has to comply with, there's some potential for disruption related to these commodity futures tradings. There's potential for that to, impact our, domestic food markets based on that, and international food markets. So it kind of remains to be seen as far as how broad the impact could potentially be. However, there is a path wherein directives issued related to this executive order could have potential impacts related to domestic and potentially international commodities markets. Lastly, for this slide, we'll be talking about Executive Order 14219, which focuses on ensuring lawful governance and implementing the President's DOGE, also known as DOGE, regulatory initiative. This executive order was issued on February 19th. Those DOGE staffers at federal agencies are directed to coordinate review and elimination of regulations along with the Office of Management and Budget to ensure that they align with the law and with the administration's policies. The timelines that are included in this direct that agency heads have to review all regulations under their jurisdiction within 60 days and identify those that are unconstitutional or impose significant costs without public benefits within 60 days. This language was kind of interesting to me because it directs agency heads to review all regulations under their jurisdiction. Regulations are required to be published in the Federal Register for comment. We'd be very surprised to see if there were any potential regulations that were unconstitutional based on that federal regulatory policy and process. Additionally, there's concern about this because some agencies have significant volumes of regulations that are under their jurisdiction. I think about the Food and Drug Administration and how many regulations are in place related to food safety and other topics within their jurisdictional scope. And I'm not sure that a thorough and comprehensive review could be performed within 60 days because of the volume. It may be something that's being performed within a keyword search, but I think there's some limitations associated with that process. I think it really remains to be seen how that's going to shake out. But that 60-day deadline is April 21st. So we should know fairly soon as far as what the outcomes and recommendations are from that order. Within that order, there's also a push for a unified regulatory agenda. The Office of Management and Budget is directed to develop that unified regulatory agenda to rescind or to modify identified regulations. There's also a portion that discusses ongoing enforcement discretion. Agencies are directed to deprioritize enforcement actions that exceed their statutory authority or constitutional powers immediately. What that means in practice is if a statute does not explicitly grant the authority for an agency or a sub-agency to engage in a specific type of work or service, anything outside of that explicit statutory language is going to be under scrutiny and deprioritize enforcement actions. Congress has delegated a lot of responsibility for how laws that are passed are implemented to federal agencies. And this executive order really intends to put in some guardrails to be more explicit about what each federal agency is doing. What that means for Indian country, like I had mentioned, there's going to be a burdensome impact related to going through all of the federal regulations. And it also is going to eliminate some of the flexibility in some instances that have been requested through tribal consultation processes. So one of the things that one of our founders like to explain is, if a statute specifically authorizes USDA to do this much work, they are going to be very hesitant to go beyond that without a justified authority and are actually going to constrain that. So this executive order is going to operate more of like the opportunity to constrain what actions that an agency or program is specifically enforcing or implementing within the statutory authority. Next slide. All right. There are also some executive actions that were issued related to regulations and rulemaking. The first one that we'll talk about is a memo discussing radical transparency about wasteful spending. There's direction, and please know that these are the accurate titles of each memo that was issued or each executive order that was issued. We're using the same language that is included as the executive order title or the heading for the executive action or the presidential memo. Within the radical transparency about wasteful spending memo, there's direction to executive departments and agencies to publicly disclose or share details about terminated programs, canceled contracts, and discontinued grants to promote transparency. There's no specific timeline here. What that means for Indian country. Some tribally serving organizations or tribal business entities have already experienced the cancellation or termination of federal contracts or awards. There are some non-governmental websites that are collecting that data and displaying it and sharing it. We know that there's a potential for further impact to tribal programs or those serving tribal programs in past agreements with tribally serving organizations. There's a common experience of that right now if programs in Indian country that are facing cancellation or contract non-payments that fall under this. The next memo that we'll talk about is a regulatory freeze that is pending review. That regulatory freeze halts the proposal or the issuance of new rules until approved by department heads, with the Office of Management and Budget Director being allowed to give exceptions in times of emergency. What that means is, as you know, we're going through the regulatory process to create rules, define regulations about how these statutory authorizations and programs are going to be actually work in practice and be implemented. They have to follow that Federal Register process. There has to be open for, a notice period and time for folks to give feedback and comments, receive those comments, adjust the language of the proposed regulation in consideration of what those comments are, and then publish a final draft. Anything that hasn't been finalized, if it was in the draft stage, hasn't been begun yet, there's a pause on it. The agencies have also been directed to withdraw any rules that are not yet published in the Federal Register and allows a 60-day postponement of recently published rules to address any questions of fact, law, or policy that they may rise. The requirements of this memorandum apply to all types of official actions by agencies, such as proposals for new rules, notices of rulemaking, and policy statements that have a broad impact and future consequences. Impacts to Indian country. We are in the middle of getting new agricultural leasing regs from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We had seen a draft version come out. There were significant comments that were issued during that time frame. We did not have a final draft yet, and that hadn't been published. And so that process is on pause. USDA had also issued some updated departmental regulations, specifically related to tribal consultation. However, those departmental regulations referenced a departmental manual. That departmental manual has not been issued yet, and we anticipate this is going to be caught in that 60-day pause as well. Additionally, like I said, any other draft or preliminary rule that have been published in the Federal Register, that's also on pause as well. Next slide. There are some impacts on animal health that we're anticipating. There is an executive order 14155 that directs the withdrawal of the United States from the World Health Organization. This was issued in January 20th on the day of inauguration. It directs the pause of future United States spending and support to the World Health Organization and recalls U.S. government personnel that were working with it. It ceases negotiations on the World Health Organization pandemic agreement and reassigns necessary activities to the United States and to international partners. within the Indian country impact, we're currently experiencing some increased rates of bird flu or screwworm. That bird flu is impacting our health of our egg-laying chicken populations, thus, resulting in that increased price of eggs that we're all experiencing. There is an anticipation that this executive order directing the withdrawal from the World Health Organization may slow once connected scientific and tracking relationships with the World Health Organization to USDA animal disease work. There are concerns about access to data related to outbreaks. One of the things that we've recently seen is the removal of different data sets from different government websites. I know the CDC has had a lot of data that was rescinded. We have seen a recension of data from the Ag Census as well on the National Ag Statistical Service website. That data in this instance related to the World Health Organization covers outbreaks, epidemic issues, and infection levels. Cross-border tracing can be pretty vital related to disease spread and animal trade. And we've seen with the lapse of programs like USAID's PREDICT program in 2019 and 2020, what can happen when those communication lines are hindered. That USAID PREDICT program was the one that monitored international animal disease outbreaks and also zoonotic diseases where they transferred from animals to humans. And some of that work helped prevent the spread of zoonotic diseases to human populations in a more broad manner than they were existing within international locations. Later during the 2020 pandemic, that program was reinstituted, but it wasn't until I believe June that it was refunded and reinstituted. And by that time, the COVID-19 pandemic had hit the United States. Today, USDA Secretary Rollins announced a 5-pronged strategy to address the bird flu outbreak. That includes importing eggs for a short period of time, a biosecurity strategy, and $400 million in financial relief to farmers. The department is also still working on a vaccine for bird flu for the animals, but it hasn't been approved yet. There is an op-ed today in the Wall Street Journal if you'd like to check that out and get more information. Next slide. There's also some executive orders and executive actions that have the potential to impact tribal lands and resources. And when we talk about resources in the context of natural resources and cultural resources, Executive Order 14154 deals with unleashing American energy. The intent is to reduce regulatory barriers that prevent energy exploration and development within the United States. It's intended to encourage exploration and production on federal lands and waters through the elimination of regulations. It also promotes the production of non-fuel minerals like rare earth minerals. It also revokes previous executive orders related to climate change and sustainability, and directs federal agencies to expedite energy infrastructure processes. There is a potential for this executive order to impact tribal lands or once protected federal lands that are tribally significant or where tribes have significant interests related to cultural and traditional practices. It definitely has the ability to impact land use issues. Sacred sites may also be impacted. It does not make any carve-outs or any exceptions for sacred sites. The American Council for Historic Preservation, or ACHP, the one that oversees Section 106 review processes, is anticipated to be eliminated under this executive order. There's also concern for NAGPRA processes and other types of regulatory review processes that create a conduit for tribes to have feedback or participation related to culturally relevant resources and sites. The next executive order, 14153, discusses unleashing Alaska's extraordinary resource potential. There's a direction for federal agencies to rescind or revise restrictions, policies, and environmental reviews implemented since January 2021 that limit resource development on federal and state lands in Alaska, including the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This executive order tasks agencies with expediting permitting, leasing, and infrastructure projects for developing Alaska's resources, particularly its liquefied natural gas industry and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. It directs immediate review of all Department of Interior guidance regarding the taking of Alaska Native lands into trust and all public land orders withdrawing lands for selection by Alaska Native corporations to determine if any such agency action could be revoked. There is a significant potential to impact Alaska Native lands and Alaska Native corporation lands, their ability to place those lands into trust, and whatever the intent for that future use of that trust land is. Indian country impact. There's going to be a review of subsurface and surface leases, as well as the environmental reviews that have previously occurred related to some of these lands. Again, all the Department of Interior guidance is going to be reviewed, and Alaska Native lands that are going through that trust application process are also going to be reviewed as well. There's a potential to impact subsistence harvest opportunities through this executive order. One of the things that we have seen recently is that even with that direction to open up more opportunities for exploration, the leases that are being offered and open for bid within the Alaska Native National, or excuse me, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge haven't generated any bids. There is some feedback, and I wouldn't call it speculation, but estimation that there are some banks that refuse to lend or loan or provide access to capital or credit for exploration companies that are interested in doing the work. That's related to a constraint because of concern about the viability of the project and the expenses related to exploring in such a remote location. Some companies are not willing to expend the costs related to developing the infrastructure necessary to actually get to that location. And there's also concern about the ability to find that resource and perform the extraction in a way that it would be profitable. There's also a recognition that energy companies are currently sitting on quite a few thousands of acres of leases intended for exploration and not engaging in that because of the costs associated with it. There's also a question about viability of a long-term continuity of the project. If 4 years later or 8 years later a new administration comes in that does not align with some of those particular policy priorities that the current administration is that lease or further opportunities for development going to go away, and that investment that's been made in that time no longer be viable? And so there's economic considerations about why some of these new leases that have been opened have not been receiving any bids. We also have an executive action here titled Putting People Over Fish, Stopping Radical Environmentalism to Provide Water to Southern California. This directs the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Interior to work to route more water from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta to other parts of the state. This could impact regional tribes within the California area, their access to water and certain wildlife. Water releases may also impact tribal producers and tribal water rights. Water releases that have occurred are anticipated to impact agriculture producers within California, their access to irrigated water during necessary times in the growing season, and definitely has the potential to impact crop yield. One of the things that came up from this particular discussion, especially related to water releases to address some of the wildfires that were occurring in California, was a federalism argument. Can the feds tell the state what they need to do? There was some pushback from California about who has the authority to make directions there, and ultimately they were successful in retaining authority and control over state resources. Next slide, please. All right. This is probably the lengthiest section discussing U.S. impacts on USDA, employment, staffing, and other federal agencies as well. There's a significant number of executive orders that are intended to impact how employment and staffing operates within the federal government. We'll go through these, talking about a lot of the information that we've heard recently about termination of federal employees, which programs are being impacted, what that looks like in Indian country, and tribally serving programs. The first executive order on this slide, 14151, ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferencing. This executive order directs the termination of all diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, including federal employment practices, union contracts, and training policies or programs. within Indian country, this has the potential to impact existing Indian country trainings across USDA if the department takes the position that tribal political status, tribal citizenship, and tribal governments are subject to race-based classifications rather than the recognition of our status as political entities and citizens of separate and distinct sovereigns. Should tribes and tribal citizens, tribal governments get caught within that racial classification system, there is a potential to cancel program funding or cease cooperations with tribes. Now, we've seen the Department of Interior under Secretary Burgum issue a statement that specifically acknowledges and recognizes tribal sovereignty and a distinct political status and the intent of Bureau of Indian Affairs to continue to serve tribes in that manner. We haven't seen something similar come out from USDA. However, we believe that that has been requested in various meetings or comments within the organization. We have yet to see Secretary Rollins issue any sort of statement specific to tribes. However, we do have our ear out for that. To reiterate, we understand tribes are sovereign nations with political and not racial classifications under U.S. law. This principle was affirmed by the Supreme Court in the Morton versus Mancari case in 1974. That foundational distinction underscores the government-to-government relationship between tribes and the federal government, and it differentiates tribal programs from those aimed at racial equity or diversity in initiatives. Case law supports the consideration of tribes as distinct political entities. The next executive order we'll talk about is 14158, establishing and implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency. Again, a reference to DOGE. This executive order establishes the department with the goal of maximizing government efficiency and reducing government spending. It also requires each agency to create a DOGE team of 4 employees hired or signed within 30 days, which was February 20th. The impact of this, this is where the question about separation of powers comes up. Who has the power of the purse and who has the authority to say how spending occurs within federal government programs? Section 4 of the executive order says that its mission is to modernize IT across the federal government. As we know, this could impact tribal use and access to data and tech systems. We're already seeing data and tech support related service contracts be terminated within USDA, Department of Interior, and other tribally serving agencies. In the best of times, these systems can be a challenge based on the feedback that we hear from tribal government users, and not taking into account the challenges of broadband access and technology options in Indian country could make any technological changes implemented in federal systems a challenge in use for tribal entities. So we're seeing that, you know, the review of federal contracts and awards is occurring. We're seeing a lot of organizations that had previously secured federal funding have those contracts terminated. There's some differing reports about how much money is being saved. And there's some consideration here when we're talking about separation of powers and who has the power of the purse. Through the appropriations process, Congress authorizes a certain amount of money to support funding for different operations of government programs. Historically, and through case law and statutes, there has been previously a bright line distinction about what the executive branch and the presidential administration's responsibility is to spend, how to spend that money and what it was supposed to be spent on. There's some significant conflict about the authority that the president has to direct the suspension of federal funds related to the implementation of certain projects or programs that were specifically authorized by Congress. I think this is something that we expect to see go through the court system in a challenge. Don't currently have updated information of whether or not any lawsuits have been filed, but I would anticipate that that separation of powers question will be something that is going to be litigated. Executive Order 14170, reforming the federal hiring process and restoring merit to government services. This order directs the development of a new federal hiring plan within 120 days, which is June 11th from when this executive order was issued, that will prevent the hiring of individuals based on their race, sex, or religion, and prevent the hiring of individuals who are unwilling to defend the Constitution or to faithfully serve the executive branch. That last portion, to faithfully serve the executive branch, is novel language related to requirements of federal employees. Previously, support for the Constitution was something that was expected within federal service. However, this new directive to faithfully serve the executive branch is not something that we've seen before related to a loyalty oath scenario. We don't know how this is going to be implemented. We don't know what criteria for review is going to be included related to what the determination is about faithfully serving the executive branch, and whether there is an expectation of that faithful service to the executive branch to supersede the Constitution or not. We're watching this one, keeping an eye on how this is going to shake out. Generally, hiring that's based on race, sex, or religion alone is already against the law. There are some instances where those criteria can be considered. However, there's a very high standard, and it's called a strict scrutiny standard that government has to meet in order to justify that. There's been a ton of case law related to, civil rights considerations within that strict scrutiny standard, and there has to be a compelling government interest to justify any sort of consideration of race, sex, or religion, or other insular and discrete minority statuses. This executive order also has 30 days to identify statutes that establish the agency or sub-agencies as statutorily required. Essentially, if any agency or sub-agency exists outside of any specific statutory authorization, it's going to be up for review. Indian country impacts. This might impact tribal citizens in federal positions if there is a misunderstanding of the legal background of tribal citizenship. For instance, the BIA has statutory provisions regarding Indian hiring preference, but currently USDA does not have a statutory requirement for that. Section 12 of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, Secretary of Interior is required to set rules for natives who can be hired. There's also language within Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that exempts businesses or companies that are located on or near Indian reservations about policies that give preference to hiring Native Americans who live on or near the reservation. There's also considerations for Native hiring preference within certain federal contracting components. And so it remains to be seen about how this executive order's interpretation is going to apply in those instances. We know that there is a potential of a misapplication of these priority hiring preferences that could remove an entire cohort of federal employees who live, work, and understand the unique political and legal status of Indian country agriculture. One of the things that the Native Farm Bill Coalition has supported in policy considerations to be included within the next Farm Bill is a tribal hiring preference for tribally facing or tribally serving employees within USDA. Next slide.
I just wanted to hop on and let everyone know we're about halfway through. So if you have any questions, be sure to keep those in your mind or prepare to send them back to us.
Thanks for the check-in, Jamie. We've got about 5 more substantive slides to get through, and I'm going to try and get through these so we have time for questions. Again, more executive orders related to employment and staffing. 14171, restoring accountability in policy influencing positions within the federal workforce. This reinstates Schedule F, which is a category of federal civil service that's associated with career civil service positions for federal employees, and removing their protections within that schedule. Agencies are required to reclassify policy influencing positions within 60 days. That's March 21st, based on the date that this executive order was issued. The Office of Personnel Management must also issue senior executive service performance plans. Senior executive service positions are classifications for higher level executives within the federal government related to their development. A performance plan is essentially a review of their status within that position. The Indian country impacts that we see here, may impact program providing services to tribes, especially if there is a large scale elimination of federal employees and staff that are administering programs or services for tribes and tribal citizens. Many programs at USDA and other Indian country serving agencies were already short-staffed, and eliminating open positions will not address those deficits. The next executive order, 14173, covers ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. This executive order directs agencies to work to end DEI initiatives in areas of their jurisdiction and rescinds DEI practices or programs across agencies. The focus here is on federal contractors and award and contract recipients that support or engage in DEI policies and preference within their hiring processes. There's a slew of executive actions that are revoked, dealing with addressing environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations, revokes the coordinated government-wide initiative to promote diversity and inclusion in the federal workforce, also revokes the equal employment opportunity in the federal government and the executive order 11246 that's specifically related to the equal employment opportunity. It also revokes the executive or the presidential memorandum of 2016 that promotes diversity and inclusion in the national security workforce. And then we talked about that other one that I have listed here. It's elimination of equal employment opportunity within federal hiring standards and within federal contracting considerations. Definitely has the ability to impact staffing and program delivery. If there will also be no federal contracts that will be issued to private contractors that support DEI initiatives. We've seen a lot of entities and corporations or businesses scrub DEI related language from their public facing platforms and documents, have retitled or adjusted the positions related to their staff that previously were in DEI titled focusing positions. The next executive order deals with eliminating the Federal Executive Institute. That's 14207. The Federal Executive Institute provides leadership training to federal executives for leadership, policy implementation, and organizational efficiency. This order directs the Office of Personnel Management to take all necessary steps to close the FEI, which is the Federal Executive Institute. The FEI trains senior leaders in federal service and offers high-impact residential programs that focus on executive development and fostering innovation within federal agencies. Again, there's a lot of institutional knowledge as people have had tenured careers and then transition into executive positions like senior executive service or, those federal executives that are eligible for the Federal Executive Institute. If there is an elimination of opportunities to support executives as they progress within their career, I would anticipate a loss of institutional knowledge and historical considerations of how programs have previously operated, what the pros and cons are related to some historical decision making. And we definitely think that this could impact staffing and program delivery due to that lapse in institutional knowledge. Executive Order 14210 related to implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency or DOGE Workforce Optimization Initiative. This mandates a hiring ratio that would essentially limit one new hire one new employee for every 4 that leave. And so that would definitely increase workforce attrition. And it also establishes DOGE teams within each agency to lead those efforts. Again, impacts to staffing and program delivery. DEI initiatives are prioritized for cuts, and there's a directive to tell agencies to prepare for those large cuts. IHS had been slated for termination of 850 positions, but that was rescinded at a very late date. There's no deadline for implementation of this particular executive order. We also know that most probationary federal employees or those that have been in their positions for less than a year have been terminated. One of the questions that had come up was many federal employees had long careers and, had been with their federal program or agency for more than a year. However, if they even recently transitioned into a new position, either through a promotion or, transition to a new department or new agency. The look back was from when they entered into that new position, not when they first started with the federal government. So there were many tenured employees that were also caught in that probationary termination. Next slide. There are some executive actions as well related to employment and staffing. There is a directive to limit lame duck collective bargaining agreements that improperly attempt to constrain the new president. Collective bargaining agreements are agreements that are negotiated. We go back one slide, please. Collective bargaining agreements are those that are negotiated between unions and the federal government. That look back goes to December 20th, and there's a direction within the order or the executive action that if the Federal Labor Relations Authority or a court with appropriate jurisdiction issues a final judgment holding that Section 2D within this presidential memorandum would prevent it from being a government-wide rule or regulations, then that section of the memo shall be severed and rendered inoperative. Essentially, if this order is challenged in court and the federal government is not successful in applying it across the board to every single lame duck collective bargaining agreement, it's severable and won't go into effect. It mentions the Federal Labor Relations Authority. That's a 3-member body with a chairperson that hears these appeals or challenges and makes a determination. President Trump removed the Federal Labor Relations Authority chairwoman earlier this year, but prior to her term ending in July 2025. There's a question about whether that removal was a lawful action. I believe that's currently proceeding through the court system as a challenge. Currently, that third seat is empty. And so if there's a split, it's a 1-to-1 vote or decision for anything that comes before them, there's no action, no outcome. And so with there being a vacancy in that, the board can still, or the authority can still meet and hear matters that are brought before them, but it requires a 2-0 decision for anything to be effective or implemented. Again, this has the potential to impact staffing and program delivery. We were able to locate 4 agreements that were signed between public employee unions and USDA programs, specifically within FNS and rural development. The 2 that cover rural development, one is with the American Federation of Government Employees, their local 2831. That union is the exclusive representative of all non-professional employees within the rural housing service. The other one is related to rural development, specific to the local in Texas. That one became effective January 16th. The one previously mentioned became effective January 17th. So within that look back time frame. FNS also has a couple of collective bargaining agreements that are up for review that were effective January 3rd and January 15th. One is for National Treasury Employees Union. That's headquartered for their headquarters location for the Northeast, Midwest, Mountain Plains, Southeast, Southwest regional employees. So that one has a much more broader coverage. There's also an FNS related collective bargaining agreement with another local of the American Federation of Government Employees that covers the Mid-Atlantic region as well. Management officials, supervisors, and employees that are described within Title V of Section 7122B 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7 are excluded. If you want to get nerdy with me and email me and say, what are those? We can do that offline. The executive orders that we discussed related to impacts on USDA employment and staffing do not necessarily apply to the firing of or termination of probationary employees in mid-February. We still don't have clear numbers on the amount of USDA employees fired. However, we do know that there have been estimates of about 2,300 with the Department of Interior, 5,200 Health and Human Services employees, and roughly 1,000 within the National Park Service. According to reports from AgriPulse, approximately 1,200 Natural Resource Conservation Service employees are believed to have been terminated. Reuters is also reporting that the U.S. Forest Service is terminating about 3,400 recent hires that exclude firefighters, law enforcement, and certain meteorologists. AgriPulse also reported layoffs in loan analysts and Farm Service Agency field offices, as well as agriculture scientists within the Agriculture Research Service. Next slide. So what does that all mean? If your tribal organization is experiencing impacts, the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs has dedicated staff that are listening, that want to hear about these particular impacts. You can email experiences or concerns by contacting oversight@indian.senate.gov. The Senate Committee on Indian Affairs has jurisdictional oversight about federal programs and operations that are serving or operating within Indian country. Next slide. So what other options exist? If you've had a contract terminated, either from your tribal government or through a tribally held business, as an attorney, I always recommend, what does the contract say? Take a look at the contract language and see if notice provisions were met, see if there's any specific resource indicated, and definitely meet with your tribe's general counsel or flag that up for review as necessary. Tribes also have the authority to request consultation about any particular order or issue that is impacting a tribe's interest, specifically related to matters or outcomes within any sort of federal policy or decision that's being made. If you want more information about how to request consultation, IFAI has issued a consultation guide that's available on our website. And you may also consider supporting tribally serving federal employees who have been terminated. What that support looks like can be definitely up to you, but we've seen examples of what some of that support looked like during the pandemic or when there have been previous government shutdowns, about how tribes have stepped in and provided support for tribally serving staff that may have lost their positions or been suspended or terminated. Within that. Next slide. So what executive orders are still in effect? Executive Order 14112. This is reforming federal funding and support for tribal nations to better embrace our trust responsibilities and promote the next era of tribal self-determination. This executive order is still in effect. It actually lines up pretty well with many of the efficiency and streamlining efforts that the current administration is pursuing in federal programs. Some of the emphasis here is to eliminate challenges and barriers to access federal programs and funds for tribes. It also directs agencies to take a look and see if they can adjust any of their regulations to prevent a third-party pass-through. There's many programs that require a tribe to receive services through a state or another entity rather than getting them directly from the federal agency. There's also an encouragement for each agency to take a look at, how they are providing support for self-determination or self-governance funding. There's direction to waive regulations or take other actions in support of program access for tribes and define flexibility to support tribes in designing new or revising existing programs. It also includes opportunities to redesign program applications and reporting requirements to reduce administrative burdens for tribes. Agencies are also directed to review tribal serving programs and report back on funding shortfalls. We have an analysis that our policy team and legal team did the review and drafted. That's available for you all to take a look at the link here. And please definitely check out the QR code. It's also available directly on our website at indigenousfoodandag.com. All right, next. Thank you for sticking with me. Next slide. All right, I'm gonna rely on IFAI staff to monitor the chat or see if anybody has any questions.
Hey, Carly, it's John. I think we're okay in the chat right now, but we'll watch it and flag anything up. If anybody'd like to come off mute, just introduce yourself, just who you're with, and go ahead and ask the question.
We can also stay on about 15 minutes after 2 p.m. if anybody has additional questions.
We do have a question in the chat. Everett Anderson, hi Everett, asks, can we find you or others from the team to meet while at Res? Yes, I will be at Res the whole week. There's also going to be a panel that I'll be on with the Native Farm Bill Coalition discussing self-governance and self-determination opportunities within the next farm bill that we hope to see from a Native Farm Bill Coalition standpoint. We will be there. Please come find me. We will also have a booth at the trade show that you can swing by and pick up some information as well. M.P.A said there was a mention of ag census data being removed from NAS. Can you expand on what data that was? Most of the data that was collected from the most recent Census of Agriculture, especially that data as it was broken out related to specific demographic groups. The Census of Agriculture is conducted every 5 years. The last one occurred in 2022. It takes a while to get that data processed, and it was just released last year. That information from that most recent data, especially that data that's specific to different minority groups or populations, was removed from the website. All right. Who can we talk to if we had questions about resource extraction in Alaska? That's Katie Hersner. Katie, if you want to send us an email to the ag policy at indigenousfoodandag.com, we're happy to see if we can answer that question. If we can't, we can try and do some research and put you in contact with the right person. Tracy Morgan asks, is this already impacting the current farm bill? The thing that's most likely to impact the current farm bill, or what's actually the extension of the current farm bill, is the congressional appropriations process. If we're talking about USDA programs, it is being impacted from the perspective of the termination of a large number of staff that are tasked with administering the programs. And so that would be the correlation between the Farm Bill, USDA authorized programs, and the staffing to support the implementation and administration of those programs. Are there any implications from the recent changes that may impact FDIPR? Yes. There was a contract that was awarded to an entity that put a bid out to do a survey for data collection about FDIPR program participant characteristics and program operations. That award was terminated. It was a $2.9 million award. Only approximately $200,000 of work had been submitted for reimbursement. There was a memo issued earlier last year that discussed a significant deficit of data related to food insecurity rates in federal nutrition programs, which FDIPR, or the Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, is. So yes, there are some implications that are currently impacting FDIPR programs. All right. Good questions. Is there anything else that anybody wants to ask?
Carly, Tracy had a follow-up on her question about the Farm Bill. She asked about FERTEP.
No notice or specific indication or information we have about FERTEP at this time. But I can research that and follow up, Tracy, if you want to send us an email.
Looks like Michaela has a question. Is it an EO or an EA or other actions that to USDA that are causing the cuts to tribal colleges and universities? Where does that?
That's an executive order. And we referenced that executive order earlier within this slide.
I'll pull it up and drop it in the chat for Michaela.
But yeah, that is okay. Great. We got a couple more minutes for questions. If anybody has anything else, or if you want to follow up and send us an email, we're happy to take a look at that as well. All right.
Carly, Jeff Kashke from IAC said thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. Thank you for joining us today. All right, we got a minute left. I'm going to say Wado and Doda Dagoha'i. Thank you so much. And until we meet again, please consider us a resource. Please reach out. We very much appreciate you all tuning in. And the work that we do is directly influenced by the feedback that you all provide. Our goals are really to be of service to Indian country. We're very lucky to have some generous funders that support our work. And if you're interested in supporting us further, please check out our website and send us an email, or if we can be of additional service to you, we definitely appreciate the opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Carly, for all that incredible information. The wealth of knowledge you have is such a great resource for us And if you guys want to stay in touch with us, you can subscribe to our newsletter. Here's the link at bit.ly/IFAI news. And then you can also stay in touch with us on either our website, our Facebook, LinkedIn. We have some really great informational videos on our YouTube and of course our Instagram. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Again, we can stay after about 15 minutes if anybody has any additional questions, but if you feel like you got sufficient information, feel free to get back to the rest of your day. So thank you guys so much.